In a world deafened by noise, the one who masters silence holds the key to true influence. Not through manipulation, but through self-possession. The strategic silence. In a world obsessed with perpetual expression, where visibility determines, value and emotional exhibition passes for authenticity, we've forgotten an ancient force, the sacred power of silence. Not just any silence, but strategic silence. This isn't about manipulation or withdrawal. It's about self-possession through profound self-knowledge. Unlike Machiavelli's political world of cunning dominance, Carl Jung directed our attention inward. He wasn't concerned with controlling others through clever concealment, but rather with understanding the hidden forces within us. The complexes, shadows, archetypes, and projections that shape not only our actions, but our very identity. This is where a different form of silence emerges, not from a desire to control others, but from the profound need to understand and master oneself. In Jungian psychology, silence isn't passive. It's the fertile ground where the authentic self finally speaks. To navigate social environments, we wear masks, what Jung called the persona, versions of ourselves crafted for social acceptance. The persona communicates constantly, performing, adjusting, reacting, apologizing, explaining, seeking validation. But herein lies the paradox. The more we speak from this persona, the less we hear from our deeper, truer identity buried beneath layers of social conditioning. Silence, when chosen consciously, is the act of stepping back from this performance. It's the sacred pause that allows us to notice, where am I speaking from? Who is truly doing the talking? Modern culture urges constant externalization, projecting thoughts, opinions, and inner states at every moment. But Jung understood that what isn't first integrated internally will inevitably be projected externally, often in ways we don't recognize. And projection is authenticity's greatest enemy. Only silence breaks this cycle. According to Jung, the shadow encompasses everything within us that we reject, suppress, or deny. The dark twin of our persona, those disowned parts that still shape our behavior from behind consciousness's curtain. Often, our compulsive need to speak isn't strength, but shadow defense. We speak quickly to avoid vulnerability. We overshare because we fear being misunderstood. We explain ourselves endlessly because we're trying to convince others of a truth we haven't fully accepted ourselves. Jung might suggest that if you cannot tolerate silence, it isn't the world you fear. It's your own psyche. To be clear, this isn't about emotional repression or spiritual bypassing. Jung's work didn't advocate becoming impassive or numb. He believed in integrating opposites, not denying emotion but containing and transforming it. To practice silence in the Jungian sense is to withdraw from reactive expression and turn inward, asking, what part of me is speaking right now? Am I reacting from a wound, a complex, a fear of rejection? Is my voice serving my individuation or just echoing collective noise? When you sit in silence, not avoidance but conscious stillness, you begin to feel the unconscious stirring. You notice what you normally suppress. Anxiety, anger, sadness, insight, intuition. This is where inner alchemy begins. Silence isn't emptiness. It's the container allowing psychic transformation to unfold. Jung described individuation as becoming whole, uniting the conscious with the unconscious, the ego with the self. It's not about becoming someone else, but becoming who you already are beneath the noise. And individuation requires inner space. If you're always speaking, you're reinforcing the ego's narrative, always explaining, adjusting, reacting. But the deeper voice within, which speaks not with words but with images, dreams, and intuition, needs quiet to emerge. This is why Jungian silence isn't passive. It's the active withdrawal of energy from performance, redirecting it inward. True growth, Jung maintained, comes not from addition but from integration. And integration requires stillness. There's also a protective dimension to this silence, connected to what Jung would call psychic boundaries. When you prematurely expose your inner process, pain, or dreams, you risk contaminating your inner work with external opinions. You become preoccupied with how others perceive your growth, rather than how it authentically unfolds. You begin performing your healing instead of living it. You display your individuation before it's rooted, and it withers. Jung often warned that individuation isn't a collective process, but a deeply personal, sacred journey deserving reverence. Not everything should be spoken. Not every truth belongs on social media. Not every dream requires public dissection. Some truths gain power by being held, not explained. One of Jung's most profound insights was that people rarely see you as you, or they see what they unconsciously project onto you. When you remain quiet, when you create space, they reveal more about themselves than you do about yourself. This is the art of holding psychological space. Like a mirror, silence reflects. In that reflection, people show their wounds, fantasies, and fears. Without saying a word, you gather understanding. Not to manipulate, but to comprehend the psychological terrain you're navigating. This isn't cold strategy. It's depth psychology in practice. In a society moving at expression speed where silence is mistaken for ignorance, hesitation, or guilt, withholding words seems counterintuitive. Yet it's precisely in this silence that the most meaningful psychological transformation occurs. Jung understood something many overlook. There exists wisdom that needs no verbalization, and a presence that grows more powerful the less it demands. To be seen. Strategic silence viewed through depth psychology's lens isn't a performance to impress others, but a commitment to remain connected with one's inner world before rushing to engage the outer one. For Jung, everything begins within. The external world merely reflects, often distortedly, the psychic forces governing our perception and behavior. How we speak, the urgency with which we share, the ease with which we disclose thoughts and emotions, these aren't neutral acts but clues about how well we know ourselves, how safe we feel within our psyche, how desperate we are for validation, visibility, or acceptance. Most people don't realize that many words we utter don't originate from our being's center but from complexes, fears, inherited patterns. They're echoes, not truths. This is why silence so confronts the modern ego. It removes language's shield. Without words to hide behind, we face the rawness of our inner experience, the discomfort, tension, questions we've been avoiding. To choose silence is to sit in that space, allowing the unconscious to surface without immediately framing, controlling, or explaining it. It means welcoming the unknown, rather than fleeing from it with noise. But silence isn't only introspective, it's relational. The silent individual doesn't just connect more deeply with themselves, they shift the psychological dynamic in every interaction. Jung understood that people don't relate to each other directly, but through projections, archetypes, unconscious assumptions. Silence, used with presence and purpose, has the remarkable ability to interrupt these projections and destabilize habitual roles. When you don't speak to fit expectations, others must reconsider their script. When you don't rush to fill space, they're left with themselves, which can be profoundly disarming. This is why silence isn't weakness but psychological authority. Not in Machiavelli's sense of dominance through manipulation, but in Jung's sense of presence rooted in integration. The more someone has integrated their shadow, those disowned, rejected parts of themselves, the less reactive they become. They no longer need to defend a fragile persona or explain every decision or justify every thought. They're not performing for approval or hiding behind noise. They're standing in themselves. That inner stillness is what others feel, even if they can't explain it. This creates the mystique surrounding individuals who speak rarely, but deliberately. Their silence isn't empty, but dense with meaning. It activates something archetypal. Perhaps the image of the wise elder, the sage, the oracle, the inner guide. In a culture saturated with speech, the one who speaks least often commands the most attention. Not because they withhold for power's sake, but because they're connected to something deeper than power. Jung believed every psychological transformation begins with dissent, the symbolic journey downward into the unconscious. This descent cannot happen amid noise. It requires quiet, stillness, waiting in darkness until something stirs. The ego resists this. It wants to act, speak, control. But the soul requires patience. The unconscious doesn't shout. It whispers, and only the silent can hear it. Many of life's greatest mistakes come from those who speak before clarity, act before groundedness, or react before reflection. Silence breaks this chain. It's the interruption allowing new choices to emerge. In negotiations, it prevents premature concessions. In conflict, it allows emotions to cool and clarity to rise. In relationships, it stops projection cycles and opens doors to genuine connection. But most importantly, in individual life, it becomes the very space where ego dies and self begins taking shape. To understand this is to recognize silence isn't passive, but active containment. Jung warned about identifying with the persona, becoming so attached to the outer mask that we forget the deeper, fuller being beneath. When we speak compulsively, we feed that mask, reinforcing the idea that we are what we say, that our thoughts define us, that our feelings must always be expressed to be valid. But sometimes the most powerful act is holding the feeling without speaking it, knowing the thought without expressing it, seeing the desire without acting on it. That's where real psychological strength is born. This restraint isn't repression. Repression is unconscious, blindly pushing things away. Containment is conscious. It says, I see you, I'm not afraid of you, but I won't let you dominate. The difference between reactive life and conscious life lives in that moment, the pause between impulse and action, the breath taken in silence. This is precisely where transformation takes root. We live in times demanding immediacy, instant reactions, opinions, sharing. But Jung reminds us the soul doesn't operate on internet timelines. It's slow, symbolic, cyclical. If we want to become who we truly are, not who we've been conditioned to be, we must reclaim the silence modern life has stolen. The silence allowing us to listen not just to others but to forgotten voices within. Creating space not just for answers but for deeper questions. In that silence, something shifts. We no longer speak to convince but to contribute. We no longer fear being misunderstood because we no longer seek approval. We no longer explain every step because we know the value of what's becoming within us. We become selective, not from pride, but from reverence, reverence for the mystery of our own becoming. Jung often said a child's greatest burden is the parent's unlived life. Perhaps our generation's greatest burden is the unreflected life, lived too loudly, spoken too quickly, scattered across too many platforms to ever come home to itself. Silence is how we come home. To be silent isn't to disappear, but to return. To the self, to the soul, to where all true transformation begins. There's a silence that doesn't signal absence but presence. Not emptiness but fullness. Not confusion but depth. The silence of someone who has met themselves fully and no longer needs external validation. In a world where most speak for attention, the one remaining still becomes the gravity center. Not because they demand it, but because they no longer chase it. This is the energy Jung described in individuation. Not pursuing perfection or power, but the inner journey toward integration, toward becoming wholly human. This journey is marked not by louder declarations, but by quieter strength. In Jung's view, power doesn't arise from dominance but from alignment. A person who has integrated their unconscious no longer acts from compulsion. They don't need to be the loudest voice because their presence already speaks. They carry the authority that comes from having faced their darkness without turning away. When such a person chooses silence, that silence vibrates differently. It holds tension, weight, mystery. There's a reason silence can make others uneasy. Not because it's hostile, but because it disrupts social reassurance rituals. Most conversations are performances. Information exchanges, yes, but also unconscious validation rituals. When someone doesn't play along, doesn't offer expected responses or speak on cue, the rhythm breaks. Something ancient triggers. Projection begins. People fill in blanks, wondering what you're thinking, why you're holding back, what you're hiding, or what you already know. This isn't manipulation, but the natural psychological effect of unfulfilled expectation, a phenomenon Jung deeply understood. Jung's work centered on archetypes, universal symbols and patterns living within the collective unconscious. Some archetypes, the sage, magician, hermit, are inherently associated with silence. These figures don't reveal themselves easily. They observe, reflect, guard knowledge until the right moment. Because they aren't always speaking, they command reverence. Their words carry weight not because of what's said, but because of the space from which words emerge. Silence filled with insight, not emptiness. This is where power shifts from external control to internal gravity. The individual speaking constantly disperses energy outward. The one speaking sparingly contains it, concentrates it. In that concentration, something alchemical happens. Their presence becomes magnetic. Their rare words felt more deeply. They aren't just communicating ideas, but transmitting a state of being. That strategic silence is real power. It activates something deeper in others, often unintentionally. This influence differs radically from manipulation. Manipulation seeks to control others through distortion. Jungian presence seeks to know oneself so fully that others are freed or challenged to do the same. Silence in this context isn't a tactic, but a natural byproduct of inner coherence. What emerges when the ego no longer needs to constantly assert its worth. But this silence can also protect. In a world demanding performance and confession, strategic quiet becomes sovereignty. You no longer need to explain yourself to be understood, share your process to prove you're evolving, or narrate your healing, vision, or goals to be taken seriously. You hold these things inward not from secrecy but from respect for your transformation's sacredness. This doesn't mean withdrawing from life. Jung never favored passive detachment. Individuation isn't retreat, it's return. But return from illusion, from unconscious projections, from the collective need for visibility to exist. You understand that true being doesn't depend on visibility, but integration. Once you've tasted that state, you see the futility in constantly explaining yourself to those who haven't met their own depths. Silence becomes a threshold, where the outer world stops and inner world begins. When you speak again, if you speak again, it's from a different place, untainted by urgency, fear, or approval seeking. Your words come from silence mined for truth, silence held long enough to distill clarity. That's why people who've done deep psychological work seem to say so much with so little, because their words aren't fillers, but vessels. This dynamic plays out everywhere, in leadership, relationships, negotiations, creativity. The person who isn't reactive, who listens without rushing to speak, who holds ambiguity's tension without collapsing into explanations, will always carry a quiet power that those still ruled by validation needs don't understand. Because it's so rare in modern culture, it's often misunderstood. Some see it as arrogance, others as aloofness. But for those who recognize it, it's unmistakable. This is someone who has met themselves. This kind of presence invites others to slow down, go inward, feel silence not as absence but as invitation. It's in this space that real relationships form, not based on projection or mutual performance, but on mutual recognition, a shared sense that something deeper is possible when we no longer fear what arises in stillness. Jung once said, "Loneliness comes not from being alone, but from being unable to communicate what matters most." Perhaps that's why so many speak so often, trying unsuccessfully to bridge a gap only presence can cross. The irony is that when one has truly met their inner world, they no longer speak to escape it. They speak or remain silent by choice, and that choice changes everything. The person choosing silence when noise is expected, containing energy when others broadcast theirs, listening to the unconscious before responding to the world. That person isn't just different, they're dangerous. Not in Machiavelli's sense, but in the mythic sense. They aren't predictable or easily moved. They no longer play the game, and in not playing it, they change its rules. This is the mystery commanding respect. Not because it demands respect, but because it doesn't need to. In the modern world, where noise has become identity and speed a value measure, choosing silence is rebellion. Not chaos or violence, but depth. Because choosing silence today means withdrawing energy from performance machinery, rejecting constant output demands, and turning toward the slow, sacred work of self-knowledge. It means remembering the soul doesn't speak in slogans and the self doesn't rise in haste. Jung understood that transformation's true journey doesn't begin when you speak, but when you listen, not to others, news, crowds, but to what stirs in your being's depths. For most, that voice has been buried for years beneath layers of adaptation, conformity, and noise. What's most real in us has been silenced by the constant need to be heard. So stopping speech, even briefly, is to begin hearing again. This isn't easy. Silence, when practiced intentionally, brings everything to surface. Unprocessed grief, ancient fear, ancestral voices whispering through dreams, longings abandoned for approval, shadows hidden behind achievement. Most never pass this first threshold. They break silence before it bears fruit, fill space before it teaches, retreat to words because silence exposes what the persona protected. But Jung taught that wholeness comes only through confrontation with the unconscious. Repressed material doesn't vanish. It waits, watches, surfaces in our relationships, reactions, addictions, sleepless nights. It doesn't want punishment. It wants acknowledgement. Silence creates space for that recognition, the crucible where the unspoken finally speaks, not with words but with images, emotions, somatic language, the soul's language. This is why silence's discipline isn't about retreating from life, but returning to it from inner alignment. Most speak to control outcomes, explain to avoid judgment, share to be chosen. But once you realize everything you externally protect stems from something internally unresolved, the game changes. You no longer speak to avoid misunderstanding. You become more interested in understanding yourself. And the more you understand yourself, the less others' misunderstanding can harm you. You begin trusting expression's timing. You no longer reveal plans from excitement or anxiety. You hold them until they mature, until they stand independently. You speak truth not because you're desperate to be heard, but because silence has shaped that truth into something clear, sharp, and alive. It's no longer reaction, but revelation. This is the paradox. The more deeply you cultivate silence, the more powerful your words become, not because you've learned manipulation, but because your words now carry the resonance of someone with nothing to prove. You're not here to convince or win, you're here to embody. And embodiment can't be argued with or dismissed because it doesn't exist in theory, it radiates. In this space, influence becomes entirely different. It's no longer about controlling narratives or persuading others. It becomes magnetic, archetypal. Others respond not to what you say, but to what you represent. Not in the egoic sense of status, but in the symbolic sense of soul. You've become, perhaps unknowingly, an embodiment of self in motion, a living symbol of inner wholeness. That carries resonance far greater than any argument. But this path also asks for solitude, not loneliness, but willingness to be with yourself long enough that your inner world becomes more compelling than external noise. Most never reach this place. They live at life's surface, addicted to speed, stimulation, social confirmation. But those walking Jung's individuation path must learn to descend, to leave approval's glitter and touch the soul's ground. In doing so, they may walk alone for a time. This aloneness isn't punishment but rite of passage. The deeper you go into yourself, the more distance you create from collective masks. You no longer belong to every conversation or need to comment on every event. You no longer seek visibility from those who haven't seen themselves. You understand sacred things aren't for mass consumption. They're cultivated quietly, protected by boundaries, revealed only when the moment is right. And when that moment comes, You don't hesitate. You speak with precision, presence, clarity. You have nothing to hide because you have nothing to prove. Your speech mirrors your silence, measured, meaningful, alive with presence. Others may call it wisdom. You know it as integration. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation as life's task. Not knowledge accumulation, but willingness to live deeply, to face inner darkness and emerge with something worth offering the world. Not noise, not reaction, but truth born in stillness. And this truth changes everything. The person who has mastered silence no longer fears rejection. They aren't fragile facing criticism. They neither chase attention nor shrink from it. They're rooted in something unshakable, not perfection or performance, but presence. And presence can't be faked or replicated. It's the fruit of 1,000 moments listening to the inner voice and learning to trust it. In a world addicted to expression, silence has become sacred. Not repression's silence, but sovereignty's silence. The silence that holds, contains, distills. The silence listening to the unconscious, allowing it to speak through dreams, art, intuition. The silence refusing to rush while the world runs. The silence remembering that becoming isn't spectacle, but slow unfolding. This isn't for everyone. It isn't glamorous, fast, or easy, but it's real. And in times when so much is artificial, the real has power. You don't need to announce your growth. Let it speak for itself. You don't need to defend your path, walk it. You don't need to narrate your healing, live it. And when you speak, let it be from the place that has learned silence's language. That is the voice the world hungers to hear, and it will recognize you not by how much you say, but by what your silence reveals.